In the early hours of January 27, 2015, Martin, his wife Teresa, and their son Rudy Van Breda were hacked to death in their sleep, while 16-year-old Marley, their youngest, was left with horrific injuries. Henri, Martin, and Teresa's 20-year-old son, who survived the attack with only superficial wounds, was initially thought to be a victim of a masked intruder. But as the details began to unfold, it seemed that the truth was far more disturbing. Henri Van Breda's version of the events seemed plausible at first. He claimed that a masked intruder had entered their gated home and attacked his family with an axe while he hid in the bathroom. In South Africa, crime is rampant, and break-ins are commonplace. Henri said he attempted to fight the attacker after watching his family be slaughtered. He claimed he received superficial cuts in the process, but eventually passed out after being stabbed. He alleged that the intruder then fled the scene, leaving him alone. When emergency services arrived at the crime scene, they found Henri bleeding from minor wounds, while his family lay in a pool of their own blood, victims of violent, targeted attacks. Rudy's body had multiple severe axe wounds, including deep fractures to his skull and neck, and he had suffered for nearly 3 hours before finally succumbing to his injuries. Martin and Teresa had also been struck multiple times, with the force of the blows exposing their brain tissue. However, Henri's injuries were superficial and inconsistent with his claims of a brutal struggle. If this were the same intruder, he would have wielded the same amount of force as with the other Van Breda victims. Why would he go easy on Henri and flee after a superficial stabbing? What's more, the forensic evidence did not support Henri's account. There were no signs of forced entry into the home, and the axe used in the killings was a family possession, not something an intruder would have brought. The fact that Henri had to search the internet for emergency numbers and wait for nearly 3 hours before calling for help raised further suspicions. If he had been genuinely unconscious as he claimed, why hadn't he immediately tried to get help for his family? Then there was the crime scene. Blood spatter covered the walls and floors of the Van Breda home, which was located in an upper-class medium-security estate in Stellenbosch. Inside was a trail that led to the bedrooms where the family had been attacked. One of the most shocking revelations came from the pathologist's report, which detailed the horrific injuries sustained by each of the victims. Rudy, who had been the first to be struck while lying in his bed, endured a prolonged and agonizing death. He had been hacked with such force that his skull was shattered and brain tissue was exposed. The pathologist testified that it would have taken Rudy over 2 hours to die, during which time he likely heard his family members fighting for their lives. Teresa and Martin also suffered grievous injuries, with Teresa's head showing signs of a fierce struggle as she tried to protect herself. Martin, too, had defensive wounds, indicating that he had tried to shield himself from the axe. But it was Marley, the youngest of the Van Breda children, who showed the most resilience. Despite suffering life-threatening injuries, including axe wounds to her head and a slashed jugular, she fought desperately to survive. Thanks to quick intervention, she was rushed to the hospital and eventually survived, though she has no memory of the attack due to retrograde amnesia. The more Henri's story was scrutinized, the less plausible it seemed. He was the only family member who survived, and his injuries were not consistent with the severity of the attack. Forensic experts pointed out the absence of defensive wounds on his body, which would have been expected if he had truly been engaged in a life-and-death struggle with an intruder. His version of events also ignored the fact that no one had seen any signs of forced entry into the home, nor was there any logical explanation for why a masked intruder would have gone straight to the upper floors to attack a sleeping family instead of targeting valuables downstairs. Additionally, neighbors in the estate reported hearing a loud argument between family members just hours before the murders likely occurred. There were also persistent rumors that Henri's parents had threatened to cut him off because of an alleged drug addiction to tick, or crystal methamphetamine, which he had reportedly spent time in rehab for. In the case of his parents' death, Henri was set to gain millions, and thus, the motive was proven. The prosecution presented Henri as the cold-blooded killer, who, in the midst of a family argument and desperate to secure his share of the family's fortune, carried out a violent and calculated attack. They pointed to Henri's behavior after the murders, his delay in calling for help, his calm demeanor during the emergency phone call, and the fact that he had lied to police about the nature of the attack. The theory was he had waited so long and had also been so calm because the intent was to let his family bleed to death before help arrived. In court, Henri was made to reenact the altercation between him and the masked intruder. Strangely, Henri seemed to be able to recall every movement and every defensive motion. Anyone familiar with life or death struggles will know that recalling them is almost impossible. Yet Henri remembered every detail. After an intense trial, the court ultimately rejected Henri's defense. He was found guilty of 3 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and 1 count of defeating the ends of justice. The judge ruled that the evidence overwhelmingly pointed to Henri as the perpetrator. His version of events was deemed implausible, and his actions following the murders were seen as indicative of guilt rather than fear. The details of the crime were so brutal and senseless that they shook the nation. The Van Breda family, once considered a model of success and privilege, had been torn apart by the actions of one of their own. Henri, who had once seemed like a victim of a tragic crime, was now revealed to be the true killer, driven by greed, frustration, and perhaps a twisted desire to escape the pressure of his family's expectations. He was sentenced to life in prison for each of the 3 murders, as well as 15 years for attempted murder and 12 months for obstruction.